going to be able to complete all our discussions needed today. So this is very beginning step. So we will do all that we can until about 3 o'clock and go into the next steps for half an hour and then go into SRNR at 3:30. With that, Madam Chair, you have a certification.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. The board, in order to comply with Section 2.2, 3712D of the Code of Virginia, it is necessary for the board to certify that since the Fairfax County School Board convened a closed meeting on June 17th, 2019, to the best of each member's knowledge, only public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements and only such public business matters as were identified in the motion convening the closed meeting were heard, discussed, and considered by the board during the closed meeting. Do I have a motion? Motion made by Ms. Schultz, seconded by Mr. Moon. All those in favor? And that is unanimous with Ms. Derenak Koufax away from the table and the 3 missing board members.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I have Ms. Evans, Ms. Colbert Sanders, Karen Kiskamara, Mrs. McLaughlin, and Elizabeth Schwartz, and Mrs. Strauss, and all the other board members as well. So we'll start with Ms. Evans. We're going to keep the 3-minute rule. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I want to thank everyone for these excellent reports. I'm not sure in my time on the board I've ever seen reports quite this thorough, so congratulations to all of you for such excellent and thorough work. I think this has given us a great foundation for moving forward and also a lot to think about. But because it's only 3 minutes, I wanted to make a couple of comments and then ask a couple of questions. One of the things that was pointed out is that parents have not had as much as much engagement repeatedly. We did back in 2013, I believe it was, have a very lengthy conversation about SR&R that took a year. But I do think that involving parents on an ongoing basis, involving students on an ongoing basis does make sense if we can do that. I see that in one of the reports, it says that parents who responded about their students' experiences didn't feel that the process was fair to their child, and that's sobering to hear that. I do think we need to be considering how to have better communications. First of all, make sure that everyone does, at the end of the day, feel that they were treated fairly, that part of the issue is educating. We are an education organization, and so we do need to have that always in our focus. But better communication about consequences. I'm delighted to see the trauma-informed piece of this. That's something that I think this board has gotten increasingly educated about, and that's certainly a good step forward. My questions have to do, first of all, with parent notification. I have long advocated for stronger parent notification in our SR&R, and we have made progress this year. We have a proposed change, but I did want to ask one question, whether any of you had specific language, because I see that your recommendations are for improved parent notification, but if you had any specific language beyond the recommendations that are being made now on parent notification. Secondly, I would ask on the Orsi report, page 26, I talked about recidivism rates being twice what they once were, and I would ask if we have any sense of why that is. The discrepancies school by school, I think it would be useful to get a school by school report. I see it's anywhere from 0 to 14%. That's quite a difference. Beyond that, I will have to wait for my next turn because I'm out of time.
Rob may have language, but beforehand, let me say that if one thinks about what you do foundationally, part of what you do foundationally is to engage parents, because the right moment to try to engage me as a parent is not when my kid's in trouble. The right moment is much earlier, and if one creates that approach, one can be more likely then to be able to reach more parents independent of language. And one can actually apply the equivalent of a three-tiered approach. What you do for parents who appear to be easy to reach, what you may do in a targeted way, thinking about groups of parents, perhaps parents who are part of a linguistic community where you'd want to reach out in different ways. And then there may be some parents who are particularly hard to reach, in part because of their own life experience. And they may be the people you particularly want to be able to reach. And if you can do that in advance, you still need the language, but then it's going to be easier to get the result you want with the language. Rob, do you have any language that you...
So I tried to find exemplar language, but it turns out that a lot of policies are struggling, and it got more to how they actually do business around these issues at the site level. As we suggested in the report, where at all possible, it should be wills or shalls, right? And we've added the documentation piece just to keep everyone focused there, and again, in other environments that was necessary to document those attempts. And I would say that along with meeting parents, meetings can include calls, because a lot of times well-intended folks were trying to schedule a face-to-face, and we delay the process or delay that conversation, and that's why we said minimally have a conversation with. And I think the current language says that parents will have the opportunity to meet or something less than, I'm not going to say less than desirable, but minimally it should be almost non-negotiable that we have a conversation, particularly if more serious things are on the table. And I have documented earnest attempts to make that happen. It's not just enough to send a letter home with the kid. You know, sometimes you have to do that, but you leave the parent a voicemail if you can to let them know that, to give them an opportunity to be aware of that. But a lot of folks are struggling with that piece in as far as the policies go, and it may be more of a procedural thing of how we go about engaging with parents, period. But I'll continue to look, though. Yeah. Okay.
And if I may add, if one adopts the type of progressive approach that we're recommending and Dr. Duran is recommending, what one might want to do is during the first year or two where you are doing a better job of engaging parents in other ways, is convene a group of people who could help you come up with what might be a better language. Because your best allies actually are your intended end users.
And in terms of the recidivism, we don't necessarily have an exact reason that it's going up. It obviously is increasing for our out-of-school suspensions and our hearings office cases. It is reflective of other information that staff at schools was telling us, where they feel like the consequences are not really impacting student behavior in the way one might hope. And so it may be an offshoot of what Dr. Osher was just saying. The best time to engage kids is also when they're not in trouble, and maybe forming those teacher-student relationships and making them more strong will over time help with ensuring that the consequences, when they do occur, are having more of the impact that they should have. But right now, it does seem that those more severe outcomes are not resulting in the kind of results that we would want them to see. On the other hand, the other kinds of consequences do seem to be somewhat decreasing recidivism. It's not very big, but the slope is downward. And so those other kinds of consequences, other than out-of-school suspensions and hearings office referrals, do seem to be at least maintaining, if not decreasing somewhat, the recidivism.
Okay, thank you. I have Ms. Colbert-Sanders to be followed by Karen Skis-Gamara.
Thank you, and I'll try to be brief. Really appreciate the detailed approach to what stemmed out of a request by the superintendent to increase our hearings office by one. And it was at that time that there were a couple of us, I felt honored to be able to work with Ms. Keys-Gamara on drafting language that said we actually need to do a deep dive on disproportionality. And so I think that we've started that deep dive. So some of the surprises, there really weren't any surprises, but you actually documented what many of us felt was inherent about the system. One is that we do not have a fidelity of implementation. We have a litigious approach to how we deal with discipline versus a proactive one. And so I think some of the recommendations here really do focus on behavioral change and rather than on being litigious. I like your ideas for increasing accountability, but it's not only increasing accountability for our students in helping them make better decisions, but it's increasing accountability at our at the individual building level. And I remember almost a year ago asking one of our regional assistant superintendents, what are you doing with the discipline data? And the response was, we don't have a systematic approach to looking at discipline data. And so we need to have those systems put in place to do that. Similarly, we need to have systems put in place for mandatory versus voluntary professional development, because for too long we've said, well, if you have time, go ahead and take this professional development. And so what would be very helpful is if you could give us, and this is a next step, a prescription of what are those professional development items that every person who touches a child at different levels or tiers should be taking. And beyond just I think that we do great things with online professional development, but there are certain things where we need to have some tabletop exercises and be more proactive. Additionally, I would like to, and I'm going to come back to it, is some more language on our social emotional learning and bias, and how you see that being incorporated into our curriculum. And I'm indicating to all of my colleagues that this afternoon, when we talk about the SR&R, I'm going to make some recommendations at the front end of the SR&R to be more inclusive about de-escalation techniques and addressing the needs of our students with disabilities rather than waiting until page 41 of that document. With that, I will cede my 2 seconds and let somebody else go, and I have a go back.
Anybody has any comments?
So we will definitely get together a list of all the mandatory professional development that we see that we will be putting in place for next year, and then also what we would like to see moving forward. Some of that you see in the equity plan under the professional development. Maybe it wasn't defined as mandatory versus not, so I'll make sure I clarify that piece. And moving forward, have a real clear understanding of what our professional development expectations are. The unfortunate piece around why some of it becomes online is because of that. If you remember on the equity plan, that scaffolding, so the online piece is really where you're talking about the assessment and the awareness piece of it, so helping people become just aware. But as we build up on that scaffold of professional learning, you'll see that step. It's really then how do we do what you just said and have those conversations, those in-person professional developments. And so that's what we've begun to do in the cultural responsiveness training next year, and we're really excited about having those modules, because this past year, it was not online. It was an in-person led at each school, where the principal and the equity lead were provided professional learning to help facilitate that. So that's more and more what we want to see, and that's where we're headed to go. But you do have to start in some cases with, for example, the Cognito, the one I mentioned, that everyone is going to take by December. That's the awareness piece. Everyone needs to be aware. We're not saying that we would stop there. That's when we'd also then go into the teams and building, and we're starting with Title I. But ultimately, our goal is, yes, everyone should have that learning. So how do we weigh and prioritize the capacity versus the need? And so that's what we're attempting to do, and I'll make sure and spell that out more clearly for you in a one-page document.
Karen Kiskamara, to be followed by Mrs. McLaughlin.
Thank you. I really appreciate this information. I'm going to go quickly, though, so I can get in as many questions without asking for a go back. On a few of your slides, you talked about how the principals were very even in providing discipline or the judgments, but that the referrals showed the disproportionality, which brings me to the question of who's the gatekeeper. Whether that principal or anyone else, our RASs, our executive principals, could be involved in the oversight, because I've had a continuous concern about accountability and fidelity. And I'm concerned about having so many different people but they all have different views, which tends to lead to the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Let's see. The second one was contact with parents. Very much agree with Ms. Evans. One of my concerns has been, are we contacting parents, particularly elementary and middle school parents, before we implement discipline? In some instances, I have certainly seen situations where in-school suspension has been used as low as the elementary school level, and the parents have not been advised until it's been implemented. Again, we need that parental engagement. Once you develop that, I think that the parent should also be a part of coming up with the solution. The next thing is students with disabilities. I'm really looking forward to hearing about how we can prevent referrals. I think a lot of this, and we've had some discussions about this, behavior intervention teachers, et cetera, whether it's a question of our teachers not just being equipped, and whether we are prepared to meet the needs of that child in terms of FAPE. You know, are we preparing those, our people to make decisions in line with what those guidelines are ahead of time? Would like to see much more on the preventive end of that. Let's see, I got my D. I think this kind of plays into a movie that's out right now, how they see us versus how we see us. I'm wondering how we really get to that fundamental thinking. Are we looking at these groups that are so highly impacted, and somehow are we, whether we realize it or not, expecting more egregious behavior from those groups? And I want to make sure that we get to that if it is possible. The other thing that I'm concerned about is, I know that these are significant cultural changes, and I'm concerned that our teachers, our folks in our schools may feel very put upon, may feel like we're taking away tools that they believe that they need. And so I want us to be conscious of their transitional period. I know that's not our goal, but at the same time, we need all our team players, and I am going to need a go back. That's the best I can do.
I'm going to put all board members on the go back list.
You want to start, Dr. Osh, and then I'll follow up? Go ahead.
Okay. Let me unpack two of our general recommendations that I think speak to your last question in particular. First, it's about assessing and building readiness. And I'll give you a simple heuristic that we have been using in our work for readiness. And think about this as a mathematical product. Readiness is a combination, it's R equals MC squared is the heuristic. R being readiness, M is your motivation. How much do you want to do something? And then there are two C's. One is the organizational capacity, the general capacity of a school that may have nothing to do with cultural responsiveness, but it still affects how things are happening. But then there is the individual capacity to meet the specific needs. And everyone is not going to be there at this moment. And that's one of the reasons why we recommend the concerns-based adoption model. And to be explicit, I loved it and wrote about this for 15 years, and then lately it became an AIR product. But I wrote about it and used it in my own work beforehand, and why I did is CBAM addresses two things simultaneously over time. One is, how do people feel, affect about something? And that's not just whether you want to do it or not, but do you feel secure in doing it and so forth. And at the same time, the second piece is, how are they developing at a skill level? And the CBAM model understands the fact that as people move through the process, it's not linear. You need to be able to respond to it. But if you're hearing the concerns people have, instead of just seeing those concerns as a problem, those concerns become opportunities to figure out what are the types of supports they may need, so they'll be able to address the things that they feel they need to do at the same time that they are being asked to meet other expectations. So I'd now pass it on to Dr. Duran or Leading.
I'm going to add one little thing before Dr. Duran speaks. And It's that in our survey data in particular, but also in our focus groups, I believe, and kind of piggybacking on what Dr. Osher just said, there was a lot of unhappiness from staff about their capacity to deal with the students' needs when they were trying to do something, but they didn't necessarily know exactly what to do for them. And then also coupled with frustration that whatever was happening wasn't working for the students. So I think that motivation may be there because there was a lot of unhappiness about sort of the current situation. So I'll kind of leave it at that and turn it over to Dr. Duran.
Your first question with regards to really kind of oversight of referrals and what was found in actually 2 of the studies was at the teacher level, perhaps some discrepancy with administrator referrals around disproportionality. And that speaks to, and how do we support that and what kind of oversight can we provide to that? And you asked about, can the RAS be involved or can the school level be involved? Principals even be involved? The challenge that we have, which I referenced in our resources, is we do not have a systemized way to track that data. So we have some schools who do it very well. They've created their own system. They have phenomenal Excel sheets and documents that they've used, and they're on it. But for us as a system to begin to look at that, we need to do what I've described and what was mentioned also, Dr. Osher mentioned it, a system-wide way of documenting and then disaggregating that data by school, by pyramid, by region, by subgroup, by student group. And that also then ties back into, I think, then at this level, when we're having our Goal 2 report and we're really digging deep into the data, that should be a monitoring piece that we're looking at as a metric to understand. So it takes a couple of things. It takes, one, having the accountability tool, number one, which we don't have at a system-wide level. 2, it takes providing the supports that are needed for teachers, as Leedy was mentioning, and a lot of the feedback that was provided by the teachers is we want more training, we need the time. And to Ms. Corbett-Sanders' point, not just online, we want more face-to-face. So it involves that, the capacity building. And then I think the third piece, which you touched on a little bit, was the whole cultural change. And so that's part of why moving forward in our next modules around cultural responsiveness and proficiency, and also thinking about even our curriculum, we have to begin to address implicit and explicit bias, which is something we heard through all of our reports in terms of helping people just to understand what that looks like and how do you approach students differently, and the student voice, bringing their voice into the picture more and more, which we're trying, which again, some schools do some phenomenal work on, but again, we're thinking here system-wide. So it takes all three. It takes having the tools to monitor and to hold accountable, having the training and the resources that you need to be able to do the work, and then also how do we make sure that we're hearing all the voices that we need to hear with regards to students, teachers, parents, et cetera, in that process. So those are the three things that we must do differently. And as a system, as you heard from all three reports, we're not currently doing that. So our beginning phase, and again on that chart on the equity plan, which is steps up, that's kind of where we're in the awareness to alignment beginning phase right now.
Dr. Ivy.
And I would just like to add that the regions are committed to aligning. And even though we may not have all of the tools and the information necessary to reach our end goal, we do have a lot of information that has been provided and that we get during the year. And we need to be more consistent in how we're analyzing what we have as we're developing things, and doing it as individual regions, coming together as regions and looking at it, all 5 regions, and making sure that we are sharing the information with the board members in a consistent manner. And Dr. Zuluaga and I are working together to prepare a schedule and a format in which to do this for next year.
And then the third area you brought up was students with disabilities, and Dr. Fergus's report, I think, hit it best on his recommendation that we need a deeper dive to really understand what's happening with our students with disabilities. These 3 studies touched the surface of that in terms of, well, maybe what was said, it was no surprise, right? But it documented for us really in a way, particularly the one slide that really stood out to me, which I had never really visualized it that way, was the academic outcome slide where Leedy was showing. That was really powerful slide. I mean, that to me was number 1 slide out of the whole study. But aside from that, why is that happening? Yes, sometimes it is training. Sometimes it's how to support students, but it's oftentimes, are students in the right services? Are they getting the right services they need? Are teachers given the right professional development they need? So it's not always about the child and their behavior. Sometimes it's, are we looking at how we have set up their supports? And students with disabilities have very specific needs. And so we don't have a deep enough dive, I would say, in this study here to give a full, complete answer on what needs to happen there, other than we know we need to dig deeper, because we do definitely see that at 3.5 times of a disproportionality in terms of their interaction with discipline. And why is that? We have a lot of, I think, theories and ideas about why, but we really need to dig deeper and to be able to respond to that third question that you raised. So I think I touched all three. If not, on your go back, remind me.
Anybody wants to make a further
I
comment?
just want to add one more thing, and this is in terms of getting better data that is reliable. The more you can address and limit those subjective offenses, the more the data are reliable. And you can make the subjective offenses less subjective if you really operationalize what's being described, which starts to make it more reliable. But at the same time, one of the reasons why many experts feel that you don't want to attach suspensions to subjective suspensions is because of the extent to which implicit bias does creep in, and we have lots of empirical data to show that this is not a value-based judgment, but rather a scientific finding.
Okay, with that, let me go to Mrs. McLachlan, to be followed by Mr. Schultz.
Thank you. As I shared with Dr. Mayo during the break, this is just incredible work that the Institute has brought to us in your research. More than 8 years ago, before I joined this school board, as a social worker with a background in mental health and my training in the juvenile court system, I was deeply troubled by Fairfax County Schools and the way it handled discipline cases, particularly out-of-school suspensions and involuntary transfers to our alternative schools, when that was really a Tier 3 approach and we were treating it as a Tier 1 at times. So, gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank you both for the outstanding work that your report has brought to us. I look forward to reading it in deeper detail, but I want to thank you for really helping our school division in its analysis, because this is when we talk about research and best practice, you are bringing us the research and best practice. And you're correct that Leedy and her team have identified a lot of common themes, but many, many of us on the board, and those of us who have served for 2 terms already, have been asking this for 8 years. And we had a discipline task force with incredibly knowledgeable people in Fairfax County, of 1 million people in this county, and it was ignored. Largely, the task force was ignored. So to see you here today, and thank you especially when you're under the weather, Dr. Osher, to be here and speak to your work, it is profound, because I'm hearing my colleagues and I'm seeing through Dr. Duran that there is a true intentionality happening for the first time in a very long time to saying, how do we really look at what discipline is supposed to be? And as the Latin word said, disciplina is to teach. It's not to punish. And yet, for too long, that's what we were doing. However, I also want to catch on something that Ms. Keys-Kamara, you said. As a social worker, I very much appreciate we have to help all of our stakeholders, and most importantly, our teachers who are in the classroom every day doing the best they can to help students, to not feel like we suddenly shove a philosophy at them and say, now flip the light switch and you're going to be entirely different. Our teachers are on a spectrum of understanding on this, so are our principals. And I want to be careful with some of the things that I heard, and I'll go do it on my go back, but I don't think we should just be saying that the variability is happening just with the teacher level. We have some principals who are doing excellent work in restorative justice, and some principals who culturally in a mindset haven't gotten there yet. We have teachers who are doing excellent work on understanding what this means from a cultural shift of, and I don't mean just people's cultural backgrounds, I mean a cultural shift on what discipline is supposed to be. So I look forward to my go back, but I do want to just ask you gentlemen if you've had any experiences with school divisions where they have these alternative schools and how they use them to involuntarily transfer students out of their base school and having to leave, and when you've seen that to be useful or when what it should be reserved for.
I once led a study for the Office of Special Education Programs on alternative schools that work. And it's not that you can't have alternative schools that work, but it's hard to find them that really work because they often tend to be places that if either are custodial or spend their time managing young people and do not spend their time in ways that are educating young people academically or social and emotionally, because you can get someone to behave if you create the right incentives or disincentives in a fixed environment, but that does not generalize outside. In addition, there is a consistent finding in the behavioral sciences that one of the most risky interventions for children who have and youth who have emotional and behavioral disorders, or you see as having a conduct disorder, is putting them together with each other. Because what you end up having is peer socialization, and it happens in alternative schools, it happens in juvenile detention facilities, and now there are good alternative programs. And I'd be happy to share that report. But more importantly, the best alternative programs are doing things that we can bring back into the school. And so, for example, and I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Mayo to give you an example, is in work that we did with the Cleveland School District, where we were facing the fact that teachers had a right to remove a certain number of students from school, a class every day, and that was problematic from our perspective, but they were not going to give it up in the contract. We ended up exploring alternatives, and what we came to was Cleveland adopting a planning center model where you didn't have traditional in-school suspension, but more learning, and I think, Rob, if you want to describe it a little, as an example of how you can bring the logic of an alternative setting into the school and then just doing it temporarily.
Sure. Quickly, the planning centers in Cleveland are what I like to call the kinder, gentler approach to in-school suspension. But in all seriousness, actually, two key things come up. The kids can self-report, and the parents can request that they go there. And there's a nice analogy, a parallel to what I consider to be high-quality alternative schools. It's not alternative equals that school where certain kids, or quote-unquote bad kids, go to. And they almost have taken on more of a magnet-type alternative as rounding out a portfolio type of thing that I could self-request to go to, or that I may end up there due to some disciplinary-related issues. But back to the planning centers, there's a heavy self-reflection mode and support mode where the student can come in. In other words, if I know I had a rough time at home the night before and I'm going to be off, I can request to go there and receive supports of highly trained paraprofessionals who really help develop students' SEL. They get monthly training, it was almost unheard of, but monthly training from highly qualified researchers and professionals in the counseling social work field. And just like traditional in-school suspensions, these are often the most difficult positions to fill because the stuff comes through these rooms. That's where the stuff plays out, And so it's really a heavy reflection piece in helping building students' skills to be self-aware and provide them with those tools in the moment to do what we as adults have gotten pretty good at doing, is checking our baggage at the door. We come to work and we can wear the mask, so to speak, and we expect them to do the same. But instead of this is a go-to place. Yes, it's a consequence, or can be a consequence, but a supportive consequence. The academics continue, structure schedules, textbooks and resources across the subject areas and grade levels. So to the extent possible, once they've de-escalated and have done their think sheet and reflected on what brings them to the planning center. And as we try to equip them with those tools, it's core that this is the academics are going to continue here, to the point of teachers and counselors coming in and support them while they're in these rooms. And even still, they're you're doing a good job if the kids try to trouble themselves into your planning center in-school suspension, and you have to set that up. That's when you know you're really clicking. And it's like, hey, no, you come see me later. I'll come check you out later. We need you back in the classroom, and that was the goal. So that's when you know it's really working. Yeah.
Thank you. I have Elizabeth, and then Mrs. Rouse, Ms. Palchik, and Mr. Kovacs.
Well, I was glad to follow my colleague, Ms. McLaughlin, because it wasn't 8 years, it's been 9 years. 9 years, I think a majority of these recommendations you and I were working on before we were ever even on the school board. The system of tiered supports, the students that are affected in Fairfax, I didn't hear the specifics of it, but they're boys, period. Boys who are minorities and boys who are students with disabilities. And minority boys with disabilities. It's unbelievable, the disproportionality. I guess, can I go to slide 17 of your presentation, if somebody can bring it up?
Okay. Okay, thank you. Someone's bringing it up.
So the discipulus is actually student. So, if we go back to the root word for Latin, we're at student. And I guess my point is, when we see this, is what is the point of the discipline process? What's the point of the policy? What is the point? I mean, that's really, to me, like what's on screen 17, not in this, in their presentation. In the systemic change that is needed within the system, of whether there's even buy-in. And a year ago, we had a discussion with some of our principals who frankly were embittered in battling us the first time we attempted to take on SR&R changes. And there was a relatively wholesale change by some of those principals at this very table. And I appreciate their willing to own this. I mean, this is somewhat, like Homeric in its length and its missive, but the real issue is, what is it that we're trying to do with discipline? I don't see, while I agree with the issues on due process, and I think that you handled it well on parents, it includes not only students who are the target of a discipline, but also witnesses. I have a huge concern in children being asked to basically impugn the integrity of their peers without parental guidance. So that's one big issue. Yeah, so for me, it's the vision, beliefs, and support of school discipline. Fully integrate our vision and aspiration. Well, you have to have people who believe this, is my point. Can we go to slide 21? The fourth bullet here, there is inconsistent data-driven site-level problem-solving structures and process. This should be the first sentence in the whole report, to me. You can't fix what you're not measuring, and this report has not been made to this board. How many times have you and I asked for it? Dozens and dozens of times, and I have plenty to say on my go.
Any comment from anyone?
I'll make one, first of all, I agree, and I'll make one comment because I will be leaving at 3 o'clock. There is a book that came out last year that I co-authored with a whole bunch of people, including Dr. Mayo, called Creating Safe, Equitable, Engaging Schools. And there are 2 chapters that deal with both restorative practice and building classroom community that I think really speak to your Homeric elements. And I think I would suggest that the vision one wants of a discipline system is that it is actually very subordinate to what is the real need, which is to create a good, viable, vital learning community where people are able to work together and deeply engage. And you don't get to deep engagement unless young people feel emotionally and identity safe. And that one is not just a challenge for young men, it's also a challenge for young women as well. And so I think if you articulate a vision, it can be a vision that can also connect to improving the learning outcomes that are being generated by the school system in ways that are really consistent with 21st century skills.
I have a Mr. Strauss to be followed by Ms. Pelchik.
First of all, thank you very much, and I was very pleased that we actually had this number of research reports from several different outside people and inside, so that it gives us sort of where we can see there's some agreement on the problem that we need to address. I have a couple of questions. When did the recidivism situation begin to increase? Because there was a decline for some years and then it turned around, because that is a data point that we have looked at for years and years and years. And I don't know if that is actually because we're recording it differently, the categories are different, or is there actually a change in behavior? So I'd love to know when that turned around. It's very important that we want to increase the student voice, because we need to have a better way of figuring out, with strengthening some of these approaches, do we actually result with better student achievement, better behavior? And I think that's part of our challenge, is how do we judge that? The 5 top behaviors that I assumed that we're talking about, it's weapons, assaults, drugs, alcohol, other violations, and I forget what the other one, I mean, those are the 5, is that correct? Because I keep seeing that repeated in all the charts. Yes?
Weapons, drugs, and alcohol, assaults, disruptive behaviors, we separated out from other,
Right.
and then other.
Okay, but those are the
Those are
5
the 5.
behaviors, okay. In Appendix F, and you can get back with me on this, Appendix F has some slides that are very interesting, that some show disproportionality and some don't. But I just maybe need to talk to somebody a little bit more about that, because there's variation in how that one is evaluated. And then the last piece, in all of the analysis, we have this huge bucket of students with disabilities, but there's a huge difference in children's challenges. And we have a great deal of research on appropriate instructional approaches for children with certain disabilities. We know some are more challenging than others, but I could see this as one. I don't want to paint all children with a disability or a 504 or an IEP as presuming that they're all, that we're all in this struggle. That's where I think, and I think somebody had mentioned that we really do need to have a better idea of who the children are, just not do you have an IEP, because then that informs us on strategies and what we need. I mean, a lot of us, we've been dealing with some rather major, big-time issues, and I think we kind of see where we need to go to improve support for children, because we've gone in one direction and maybe we need to go in another. I think those are my questions. And I guess the other question is because you've talked
I
about.
think your time is up, Mrs. Strauss.
All right, fine.
Okay, so I will try to hit some of them. The recidivism actually started increasing after 2015-16, so in 16-17 is when we see the uptick, and it's going up in hearings office. It's rising kind of even more highly than it is for suspensions as the outcome. I think previously when we've shown you recidivism data, most of the time that's all been lumped together. But so it was regardless of what the consequence was, or sometimes we only showed you hearings office. In terms of the disproportionality, yes, there are some times and with some offenses where there is less disproportionality. It tends to be with the more objective violation types. So in Appendix F, where we have it broken out in lots of different ways, you will see some, in some cases, English learners are not disproportional, and sometimes they are, and sometimes in some years they're not, and others they are. But those 4 groups that I had mentioned originally are Black students, students with disabilities, males, and our students who are living in poverty. All 4 of those groups tend to be very consistently disproportional. And then I'm not sure if those were the 2 I noted. Okay.
I have a Ms. Pelchik to be followed by Mr. Narcofax.
Okay, thank you. Also, we'll try to go briefly. Really appreciate these reports, and the work going into them. And I will share a couple of things I think most stood out to me, and then a couple of questions that I may or may not have understood. Number one, I really am very excited that we're continuing with the modules. A question with that would be, do these trainings include self and or peer evaluations or rubrics? Or, I know when I was a teacher, we had, self-evaluation rubrics for all of these things that we were trying to improve upon. So, and then looking forward to, being part of evaluation systems when that training is there. Love the equity ambassadors. I think that's great. I loved from your report the authentic family and youth voice and engagement, because I think often we're talking about getting voice in such a large system. Often that is surveys, right? So what do we do in such a large school system to make it more authentic, to make sure that we're really tapping into maybe people we're not normally hearing from or who don't have that opportunity. Completely support the parent notification. As you know, I had to follow a motion because I think we need to improve all of our interpreting services, which also will, I think, improve the voice. Then I had a couple of just smaller questions I guess as we're looking at the recommendations and I'm trying to better understand the next steps. I guess first of all, if our 2 experts had a chance to look over what is proposed by Dr. Duran and his team, and if you had any feedback or had a chance to look over what they're proposing and any recommendations. And then I appreciate that you shared about Cleveland. The big question in my mind is, right, what is working, what has worked, and perhaps it's in your book, and what do we need to do to get there? What's an appropriate pace of change to get there? And how do we, I guess, as a school board, work with staff and ensure that the appropriate, funding, oversight, best practices are there? Because there's a lot, like you said, I've gone into some schools, see some really good things happening, whether it's around data, PBIS, responsive classroom, and then you just wonder, how do we get it across the board, but not just at every school, but like we said, in every classroom. And I especially love what you were sharing about those centers, the planning centers. And so is Cleveland the only one that's done that? And how can we start to look at trying to implement that in our system, keeping in mind we've often had pilots that then don't grow. And so I think that's one of the cautions we have in Fairfax County is finding the right thing and then standardizing it and continuing to support that.
Let me say that we saw a draft of the report, and I liked what I saw in the draft. Having seen it in its final form, I agree with it. I think all we would do would be suggest where it might be deepened or amplified, but not change the sequencing. So, for example, I think the focused professional development, as much as possible, has to do things like include the self-assessments, but also make sure that people don't experience the different pieces as being just separate, but see the connections, but do it also with a nuance so one doesn't confuse cultural responsiveness with trauma sensitivity. So it's more a deepening. I think also doing more readiness assessment, I think, is something that I think is often very, very important. But I very, very much say independently that I think the plan you got made sense to me, and I wasn't hired to say that, okay? Now, in terms of the Planning Center, let me tell you the birth of it, actually. The Planning Center actually was first developed in a more, in a middle-class school district, Westerly, Rhode Island. And there they had the Planning Center staffed by people who had MS-level clinicians degrees. Cleveland, when this came up, which was at the end of the Great Recession, had no resources whatsoever. And so we went back and forth with a colleague of mine who was a school psychologist, fighting each other lovingly, because he didn't feel initially first that one could do it without clinicians. I felt that there was a potential in paraprofessionals, in part because they came from the community, but we knew we had to do something that gave them more support. And when Dr. Mayo talked about the fact that what you have is this ongoing support where once a month for a whole day, people are being trained up, and you also have consistent reporting, it becomes possible to leverage this. There could be a Fairfax version which might be different. It might be half of what Westerly was doing and half of what Cleveland was doing. But the main thing is to try to do something that enables young people to go into school. And then, as a rule of thumb, I would say, based on our best knowledge of what does it take in a relatively large or large system to get to some level of excellence, it's between 5 and 8 years. It doesn't mean you can't make results immediately, and that's one of the reasons why I think all the recommendations that you've had say, look at the schools that need it most, target in and keep on doing things, collect data so you can get better. But ultimately, scaling up means that you want every teacher who's interacting with every young person to be able to do things with quality in every classroom, in every school. And that, no matter how great a superintendent you have, or how great the policy is, you can't mandate that. You can, however, develop it. And you can really build a culture in a district that could do that.
Just to add to that, many of our professional learning opportunities do embed assessments, and one is obviously I talked about in the plan, the equity audit, which is a tool that's being provided to schools to help look through a rubric lens about some of their practices, their policies. So that is one. Also, we talked about the MTSS framework self-assessment they'll be doing. That is based on a framework and rubric. And then inherently built in the Equity Cultural Responsiveness team, which I think most of them are in the room on the back. They work very closely on developing the curriculum and making sure that they embed not only rubrics per se, but also time to self-reflect in small groups by grade level. So throughout the module, there are inherent opportunities to self-reflect through the means of rubric. What I think, not always a rubric sometimes, maybe it's an activity, maybe it's a turn and talk, reflecting on an article, but what we're proposing here with the next level of modules 4 and 5 is to really connect it back to some of the research and then look at some of the individual data from the school to help assess what the school is doing and what is your part in contributing to the success, or how can you help reduce what you're seeing as a disproportionality at your school. So inherently in that, there will be rubrics connected to evaluation of your data and looking at what are some of the practices you see. So we're starting, and we've started, the team has really done a phenomenal job about thinking at it as a school level with the equity audit as the tool, and it's actually research-based tool that they've done some finding on from Maryland that's been used in their schools. And then how do we take that down to actual individual activities and actual conversations that happen through the modules? So it's a combination of both.
Mr. Colfax, to be followed by Mr. Wilson.
Thank you all for this report. It's very enlightening, and I appreciate it. There's, as one of my colleagues said, there's still a lot of data for us to unpack, and I look forward to continuing to do that. We have been talking, as some of my colleagues have referenced, about the need for a system-wide way of documenting this. And as some people said, without this data-driven approach, there's really no way to find fidelity. There just isn't. one of the things that I'm always troubled with as a board member, particularly when I first got on the board, and I've been on the board 8 years now, was an important data point is the key warning signs. Because when I first got on the board and we see, when we see a child who's been referred to us for discipline, not always, but often, there have been several warning signs. Why wasn't this caught? What is, and we talk about how we have very large comprehensive high schools, but again, I think because we don't collect that data, we're not looking at it in a systemic way, and that's maybe some of the reasons this, fidelity of implementation is so hard to grasp for us. So I think for me, when one of the things, and I'll just say this to Dr. Duran and Dr. Ivy, I think in a system this big, we have to try to find a way to kind of, get it to a point where we can, manage it. And I think the RASs are going to have to play a very different role than what they currently play in order to get this to, that's our regional assistant superintendents. I think that's very, very important. Another thing is, what you said, the plan outlined isn't one size fits all, and some schools need more support. I'm one of 3 board members that represent hugely high impoverished areas, and it's not the same through all of the board members. And so we've seen some of these things and know this, and we have been clamoring for this data for a long time. Another thing, models, when you talk about models of success, I'd like to hear a little bit more, my one question, my 28 seconds, parental engagement. What are the models of success in that? Because I know some of my principals are trying so hard and they feel like they don't have a team approach to that in some of the schools that I represent. So models of success, how do we do it? And also then engagement of all stakeholders like we were talking about, making certain that our teachers and our principals do have a buy-in because we're at various levels, and I think we need to come together because of the data that we're seeing.
So in terms of models of success, I'll start now, but what I'll be happy to do is that I don't know what the right protocol is, but I'll send some materials to Dr. Duran that he could then circulate so you could read more. But let me give you some principles here, okay? One principle is the fact that one wants to make parents feel welcome in the school system. And not just that they either have to be there at a certain point or that they're unwelcome. A second principle is being family-driven, which is really to try to find solutions that meet the needs of the learner and the school system, but make sense to the parent within his own cultural and individual context. It's what you experience if you have a good doctor and you say to the doctor, what you want me to do, I can't do. The doctor doesn't give up. The doctor listens and comes up with an alternative solution. That's being family-driven. And the third thing, and I'll send you a book about it, is being culturally competent in being the family-drivenness. So it's not a one-size-fits. And then I should say the fourth is using some type of multi-tiered model, and data can help. Who are we reaching and who are we not reaching? And some parents are easier to reach than others. And that doesn't mean you don't want to reach them. Take advantage of that, but make sure that that does not become the end-all, but rather that means now you can target more of your resources to be reaching other people. But I'll send materials.
Mr. Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Moon. Just to echo, you've given us a lot to think about today and the presentation, and I have to confess that I don't think I've sort of got my arms around what we're talking about here. I mean, you've referenced it as a sort of a 5 to 8 year process to implement, in taking those first steps. And I see here on this slide that we're in the early stages of tier 1 implementation. So I wonder whether, Dr. Duran, you could just talk about what does that mean, just for people that might be watching? What does that mean we're in the early stages of Tier 1?
May I just say one thing before, just to make sure I did not set you up? I believe in A pluses, okay? And so when I'm saying 5 to 8 years to get to scale, that's at a level that most places don't get to, okay? It's not that you can't do things a lot earlier. It's just that if you really want something to take and transform a system, you can't do it overnight. With that, I pass it to Dr.
Can you
Duran.
turn to slide 3 on the AIR report? That might help visualize a little bit. But as you think about Tier 1 and what Dr. Osher and Dr. Mayo presented to us, when we think about really truly having, and I'm going to read the words here to help clarify that, coordinated services and practices. And those two things, coordinated services and practices, that are creating a caring school environment which supports positive discipline, academic success, and healthy social emotional development. So where we are in our beginning phases of that is that we saw through the data, we see that we're not yet achieving that for all students. We've begun to look at multi-tier system of support as a framework. We've begun to train teams from schools. We've begun to train individual teachers. We've been cohorts of schools on how do you do this, but we're not there yet. So what we think about, we're in the beginning phase. We have, and it goes back to the equity plan, that tiered scaffold. Again, it's that assessment and that awareness piece. And now the third box, which is the green box, is the alignment. So how do we begin to align all of our policies? We're about to do that and engage in a discussion around SR&R. That's one piece of the pie, a very small one, because discipline shouldn't drive our work. How do we align our curriculum? Every year we are discussing with the board about potential new curriculum that's being aligned, new instructional resources. How are those aligned to this end? What we have done a phenomenal job of doing, which Dr. Osher and Mayo commented on, is Tier 2 and Tier 3, where we have those interventions and supports for students. But how do we become more proactive through our curriculum, through our policies, through what Ms. Dernak-Kofax was asking about in terms of relationships with parents and our students, and the student voice, which has been mentioned? That is what's not yet, to use the words from their slide, coordinated and a practice. For something to be a practice, it needs to be seen regularly and consistently across. And that's why we're in the beginning phases, we would say, in terms of that Tier 1 approach.
So just to follow up just briefly, so in the early stages, would you describe it as being being piloted in certain schools or certain clusters of schools, or is it happening universally across?
It depends. I wouldn't say it's always piloted. In some cases, if you're thinking about Tier 1 approaches, it's making sure you have a policy that's clear, a vision that's clear, the resources needed, and then the professional development. That's the hugest part of this process. The biggest part of this process is the professional development. A couple of your colleagues have commented on the notion that for teachers and for school staff, it's getting them the supports that they need. That's not a pilot. That's really capacity building and awareness. Some cases, it might be a pilot if you're thinking about a specific SEL program that we may be piloting through an RFP process. But more so, it's really developing capacity and changing practice and having the resources and the ability to do that.
And in those cases, how have the teachers in the classrooms responded to the suggestions and SEL promotion that are being put into place?
Well, again, what we heard through the ORSI qualitative focus groups is that they feel that they don't have those tools. They're not been presented with that learning, and they want it. They feel that they look at discipline, and in particular, we're talking about discipline today, but you could talk about it in curriculum too, that we have set forth, here's what we expect of you, but without helping you develop the tools to do that. And so how they've responded, and I hate to say they because that's a large group, but kind of the buckets is, if that's the direction we need to go, we need more help and support in how to do that. And what does that really look like? And what is the expectation from the district, because what we read and what we see, and this also came out through the focus groups, what we read and see in terms of policies and regulations don't tend to direct us in that way. It seems more punitive. It seems more of a focus of how do you handle students versus develop students. And that's the kind of feedback that we're getting in the early stages. And I don't know if you want to add more to that, because you conducted most of those surveys and the focus groups, but really it's a need of how do you support us through this, and really what do you expect us to do? There was a lot of, to use a word I think you said at one point in your report, and you told me, confusion.
The only thing I was going to add is we've had a lot of focus in the last several years, or even the last decade, on having teachers figure out multi-tiered systems of support for the academic part of it. And this is trying to not just have it academics, but academic, behavioral, and wellness all together, and making sure that teachers know how to do it for all three of those components for students. So they feel, I think, confident in the academic part. It's helping to help give them the support so they feel just as confident for the behavioral and the wellness part as well.
And then the last thing I will say is we also need to have, and as part of the equity plan, is the MTSS, multi-tier systems of support, an assessment that the schools conduct, and that working with the regional assistant superintendents, really understanding where are schools in that and what kind of supports do they need, because school A versus school B might need something very different as we think about moving from tier 1 to tier 2. And so there's an actual a framework and a rubric and a question that is done by schools to give an assessment. And then, as I talked about in our plan, after doing that and working with the RAS, we would then develop a plan of action for each school for the following year to put in full implementation towards multi-tier system of support. But to your point, what people are saying about it, we actually need to gather that a little bit more.
So that actually, I mean, that really is my next question. And a collection of data, and I think Ms. Schultz brought this up, is that there's been inconsistent collection. So in addition to making it consistent, what other types of additional data do you need to collect, and how would you go about collecting them? Because I'm concerned about putting burdens on classroom teachers in terms of collection.
Well, I think if you're speaking about qualitative data, that's what I was referring to, some of those self-assessment pieces. We need to do that more. We need to align it as much as possible, if not directly, to our school improvement and innovation plans, and also to our strategic plans, so that schools aren't asking to do 3 or 4 different things, which is why I'm suggesting making sure that what we're asking of schools is a metric in the plan, so we're not asking them to do all these different things. That's one. 2 is the data, the quantitative data that we can have by simply creating a system and having a system-wide way of gathering what those referrals look like, so that schools aren't having to provide us any data separate than once they input it, we can then pull those reports, we can analyze that without asking them to do that extra step. But right now what we do is we literally have spreadsheets. We actually, people email us papers, scan it. I mean, it's a variety of ways to gather for some of the referral type data. So it's having those tools that once you input it in, then it's not going to be an extra burden for a school or a teacher to have to develop a report on. We would then be able to run those reports and then even actually provide additional data for them to look at and review.
If I may add, not from Fairfax, but what we know about how do you make change and practice change work, it's a combination of coherence, making it easy, and ultimately enabling people to see success. So that while some people may commit to an idea before they experience success, other people will only commit when they do experience success. And part of that is enabling people to get to the point that they can experience the success. And I think but the logic, in your own set of recommendations of picking some things to do and providing the coherence is important, because that's one of the ways in which you can focus the professional development in a way that it makes it easier, that more people will start to experience that success, and it will also become part of a teacher culture where they can help each other experience that success.
I think Dr. Ivey wanted to comment as well.
I just wanted to add, I agree with everything that's been said, and there are 2 pieces that were said earlier that we can't forget, and that is the fidelity of the implementation and the accountability. And the accountability at the school level and at the region level and on up.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Wilson, any further questions?
Not now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I guess I'm the last one on the list before we do go backs. Thank you for the presentations and very detailed report. I have not been able to read every single line of all the reports, but I've read most of it. And I appreciate especially the report from OLC2. And I have some questions regarding some parts from the OLC report. As I understand that creating a positive school climate, whether it's a teacher-to-student relationship or student-to-student relationship or parent-to-school, parent-to-teacher relationship is important. But at the same time, on page 32 of OLC's report, in the right below, finding number 15 in the first section, what I saw seems to be contradicting that assumption that I had just laid out, because it states that the relations between school practices, school climate, and discipline outcomes became statistically insignificant once the differences in school demographics were taken into consideration in the analysis. Or stated another way, discipline outcomes were associated more with the differences in the student body membership and how staff responded to those differences than school practices or school climate. Could you comment on that?
So we did generally find that relationship between the more positive climate having better outcomes. So we did find it. What we found was that the demographics in some of our schools indicate that the climates themselves in some of our schools are different, and that our high minority, high poverty schools actually have lower levels in climate in general, not just perceptions by students, but that the climates in those schools are actually different, and that's more predictive of outcomes than any of the positive behavior aspects of it. So part of this, I think, feeds into that overall notion of trying to change how people are approaching things in the schools so that the climates themselves in our schools that are high minority and high poverty are equal or similar to the other schools as well. And so yes, right now we do have demographics as the biggest predictor, but that overall notion that things about school climate predict better outcomes was there. It just was overridden by some of the differences we're seeing with things being different in some of our schools.
Yeah, and let me add more from being considered an expert in school climate, that I think what you have here is a product of a number of things. One is the fact that different people in different schools experience climate differently. And what we know from research is particularly people who face other obstacles in life. And so, for example, the racial gap between a student and a teacher doesn't just exist in school. People experience it in the media, people experience it outside of school, are particularly susceptible to bad climates and tend to respond even more strongly to positive climates. And so partially what you may be seeing is that. But secondly, I think there are two more points. The second is the fact that for climate to have a powerful impact positively, it has to be very strong. There's a difference between sort of feeling okay, and I sort of feeling the teachers care about me, and feeling that teachers have my back, to quote students in one high-performing school that I spoke about. You want to get measures of that. And when I heard Dr. Duran in the recommendations talk about trying to add some items that might be collected from students, I think you would want items that can get you deeper into those aspects of climate that I tend to call conditions for learning. They're the ones that really are cutting to the bone, that affect issues of performance. And at the same time, and let me stop there, and I'm sorry for being less coherent than I usually am, but this head cold is in the way.
Along the similar vein, let me ask you a follow-up question regarding school climate. Somewhere in the report, I cannot find the exact page. My recollection is that the school climate has very minimal impact on certain subgroup, i.e. Asian students. Could you comment on that? Did I read that wrong?
I think what you're referring to, and I'd have to find it exactly in here because I don't know which page it's on. What we found is that Asian students' perceptions of climate were pretty much the same and more positive than all other groups, regardless of which school they were in. So unlike what I was just talking about, where demographics seem to override, Asian demographics did not override anything. Our Asian students, if they're in a high poverty, high minority school, feel more positively than all other students. Our Asian students, when they're in a low poverty, low minority school, feel more positively than other students. They report feeling more positively regardless. And I would have to track down which page that's on, but yes, I believe that's what you're referring to.
Okay, let me ask you a different question that since I have about 70 seconds left. I think when you and I were preparing for this work session, I did ask you this question about the relationship between discipline outcome or discipline or out-of-school suspension on student achievement, that a suspension having a negative impact, obviously, on student achievement. I mean, I get that. I get that. What about the other way around? Do you think a lack of student achievement might have an impact upon certain behaviors as well?
There's a great deal of research that supports that students who aren't engaged and typically are not performing very well academically are also going to have more discipline problems. So in general, there is that reverse order as well, and they seem to be sort of tied together. When you're not engaged in the learning, that you're more likely to have discipline issues as well.
And let me add something, and I've not read Dr. Fergus's report. I respect his work a lot. We've worked together, not on this, but in other places. That we've talked earlier about implicit bias. There's also mindsets that teachers may bring to different student bodies, and students experience that. Do teachers see me as someone who really is a potential learner and a scholar, or do they see me as somebody who at best can do rudimentary work? And students can pick that up, and that can very much affect their behavior. In addition, even early interventions academically from an MTSS perspective, if they're not done well, can actually maybe help a student learn a skill, but at the same time give them the message that they're not a learner. And if you're in a school where you should be a learner and you don't feel like you're a learner, you're more likely to act out. Or if you're high performing with ADHD like I am and you were bored in school, I'm one of, other than white privilege, I would have been one of those kids because I could not handle the classroom. And the solution in part is to create environments that are more responsive to young children and see in each child the potential for that child to succeed. Teachers need growth mindsets, not just students need growth mindsets. Intelligence is not something that's just genetic. It's not genetic. It's something that is developed.
I mean, I agree, Dr. Osher. With 35 seconds left, let me ask you this question, that I understand that we don't keep track of the staff members who do make disciplinary referrals, and we hopefully will be collecting those data as we go forward. By then, it then means that we don't collect the information about the gender of the staff members making referrals either, and that may have a huge impact, you think, potentially on why male students have a such higher percentage of disciplinary referrals with a much larger percentage of our staff members being female. Is that probably a pretty risky assumption I'm making?
I think it's definitely something we need to look into once we're able to track the staff member who is making the referrals, look into which staff members are maybe sending the most referrals, and then what might be behind it. And it may be something related to gender, it may be other things. But I think once we have that system in place, it'll be easier for us to take a look at that.
Okay, thank you. With that, now we only have 12 minutes left for Dr. Mayo and Dr. Osher. So among those board members everyone is on the go back list, by the way. If anyone has questions to ask of those two departing scholars, I'll give you a minute each first. Starting with Ms. Evans, you have questions?
I do.
Please.
First of all, a comment about the discrepancies from schools, and I would say that this is yet another reason for us to clearly address the issue of socioeconomic resegregation, which is something that we really do need to attack head-on. So this is yet another example of why we need to take a look at that in our schools. Going back to the parent notification piece, I wonder, because we did have one significant change being proposed this year, we had asked, in the past, we've said parents had to be notified as soon as practicable, but before a written statement when a student's in serious trouble. We're changing that to saying they can't be questioned before a parent. There's an attempt at least to notify the parents, which I think is a very positive change, and that will be a culture change. I wonder if it would be possible for Dr. Osher and Dr. Mayo to take a look at the paragraph and at least let us know if you have suggestions. I think it's a paragraph or two. I would certainly be happy to get your input. We are addressing this on Thursday, so it would be a quick turnaround, but I would appreciate that.
I'm passing it on to him if they need it by Thursday.
I'm only giving 1 minute each.
So then put me on the go-back list.
Okay, shh.
No, I
Okay,
understand.
you are on the go back list.
All right.
Thank you. You want to comment on that?
No, go ahead.
We'll definitely take a look before Thursday, another look.
I would very much
Okay,
appreciate
thank
that.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, I had Colbert Sanders next. Do you have questions?
Yes, I was intrigued by the uptick in discipline once we get to middle school, and there seems to be a correlation between how we address responsive classrooms and positive behavior supports in elementary school that then falls off in middle and high school just by structure of the block schedule. And so I would like very much to hear your views on that, and then I have another question.
Jackie Eccles, who's at the University of Michigan, has written elegantly about the lack of developmental fit between the needs of emergent adolescents and middle schools. Just at a moment where you need to experience more autonomy, people ratchet up the behavioral expectations and tell you that they can control you, and just when you need more voice, you tend to experience less voice. And so I think my comment is your instinct is right, and I think that what's important is to find the equivalent of a responsive classroom at the middle school level, and it is possible. If anything, one of the key elements of the responsive classroom is the morning meeting, and a second piece of it is the development of rules. And adolescents are even at a greater point where they can do it. You may want to do it differently. You may connect it with advisories, but anyway, I think your instinct is right, and you further need to do it at a high school level, and the challenges are even greater there.
So recommendations on how we can get there would be greatly appreciated in that area. Similarly, I was very interested in your planning centers and how they are actually self-contained in general education buildings rather than as separate entities. And so I would like to understand how long it took both Cleveland and Westerly, Rhode Island to move to that model.
Okay, and we'll both give you answers. I'll also send you one or two monographs that actually describe Westerly, okay, that we did many years ago.
Thank you. I'm going to cede the rest of my time for my later discussion.
Okay, thank you. I have Karen, you want to ask questions?
I'd like to get your comments. It's also a next step. somebody said that there's been no benefit shown from having kids out of school. So I'd love to hear any comments you have on what is a healthy structure of an alternative school. And also, in trying to change the culture, I'm particularly concerned about where the hearings office and any recommendations you might be able to make there with respect to how we achieve that change. And then making sure that we have that higher level of fidelity by utilizing the RAS as executive principals or whomever you believe might be necessary. I assume you got an overview of our structure.
I'll briefly respond on the alternative school, but I'd rather send you the 2004, 2006 study that probably still holds up. I'll double check it. The schools that really work see themselves as educational institutions, not just as behavioral control institutions. They see themselves as preparing young people to return to the regular classroom, and they end up developing relationships with the regular classroom so that they can be a potential transition. They're also rich with adult support. Remember, one of the ways you can deal with the negative peer socialization that I mentioned before is if you have adults who are very, very skillful and are involved in working with the young people. And those, so those are some of the reasons. One way of knowing whether an alternative school is working is looking at your attendance. If kids are really attending it highly, it's likely that that school is something that is giving them something. Typically, in many public systems, if you look at the attendance rates for the alternative learning centers, they tend to be low, and they tend to be low because students know that they're not getting anything.
Okay, thank you.
I have 11 seconds, 9 seconds. With respect to the programming in the alternative schools, is it comparable or the same as the schools where they were sent from?
It typically is not, but it could be, okay? That actually, I had the privilege of reading a book to give a comment that came out this year by someone who ran a very effective alternative school that also realized high academic outcomes. And I'll get you the reference to this but I can tell you what she said in the book, which she said, for our school, social emotional learning is a way of life. And that was the key to creating a circumstance where the young people could succeed academically as well as behaviorally. But I'll get you the reference to that book.
Okay, thank you. I have Mrs. McLaughlin next.
I want to follow along what my colleague said. I don't know that we'll have much time for more discussion, but I would actually, gentlemen, want to ask you to be very careful in your ability to actually understand how Fairfax County Schools uses its alternative high schools, where the board gets involved, and we see it as first-time offenders predominantly when it's been a first-time marijuana offense. And you're taking kids sometimes who have, they're thriving academically, and it's from a punishment standpoint of they need to understand it's a serious consequence, which it's not good to do that, but sending kids involuntarily against their parents' wishes for a half a school year or more, there's a different curriculum that's delivered, so it's hard for them to get back on track. There's no extracurriculars for them to do. That's where some of us are concerned about how you use an alternative school. Is it from a pulling them out from a consequence standpoint as opposed to they're not thriving in their school? From, addiction or substance use is one thing. It's a different thing when you're talking about trying to help kids behaviorally because they're not thriving. I
hope I'm being clear. I think in most alternative schools don't work, and they don't work for the reasons that you're describing. That I was asked a question, could an alternative school work? Yes. Is that your ideal solution? Even then, no, because of the fact that I think if one can bring the best of the alternative setting into the real setting, I think you succeed. To leave you with a metaphor, since I'm leaving right now, and I first got into this type of work by focusing on young people with emotional and behavioral disorders is my sense then, and it is 25 years later of a 50-year career, that those young people are like the canary in coal mine. If you can make schools work for them, they'll work for everybody else. Because these young people are more responsive to the environmental toxicities. And so beyond the fact that most alternative schools don't work, ideally you lose the ability to make your own schools better. Okay, so.
Okay, I think I have just one more before we let you go. Mr. Schwartz.
So one thing that I didn't get to, in addition to the witnesses, questions about compelling students with intellectual or emotional disabilities to make statements that either get themselves in trouble or impugn others. Young children, having young children, and I imagine the age is 10, having a child at 10 or under making a statement that, again, sets them into a discipline trajectory. And then when discipline occurs in the school year, I posit, I don't know, I have a hypothesis that things that bumper quarter ends or grades coming out or college applications or high stakes tests turn into, in an anticipatory fashion, potential discipline issues and absenteeism, et cetera. And I think that we need to hear professional input about how we treat young children, intellectual, emotional disabilities, and then watching for on the data when it happens in the year. And if you have insights on that, I would love to hear it and help us inform better policymaking.
So there are many rich things you were saying, but two things. Number one, I think it's always important developmentally to think about what you would want to force young people to say or not, because of the fact that it can have consequences in terms of themselves as also in terms of peer interactions. I will send to Dr. Duran a different piece of work that with others I've been involved in on the science of learning and development, but it's basically about the fact that the most important things in schools and learning is the ability of adults to attune to young people, and for young people to attune to the work. And what gets in the way is stress. Okay, it's a long story, and I'll let him, decide whether or not it makes sense to share and things like that. It may take you in a different place, but I'll send you the science piece, but the practice implications pieces, because I think you can create environments that address some of the stress elements that affect not just the young people at those moments, but the behavior of the adults who are working with the young people.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. With that, yes.
Thank you for being very attentive.
Thank you both. And we'll make sure if there's anything in the next steps that come about that you need further clarifications, and certainly all the things that are being sent to me, I'll make sure everyone gets that. So I know we're about to do next steps in a little bit. I'll make sure that Dr. Osher and Dr. Mayo, who've been phenomenal to work with, very responsive. I know they will get back any answers that you may have. Thank you both for being working with us on this project. We appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We're gonna use another 15 minutes to continue having a discussion with Dr. Duran and Leedy, and we'll stop at 3:15, about 3:15, to do the next steps until 3:30, and we'll take a break and go into SR&R. So I had Mrs. Strauss next.
Yes, I have a quick question. There have been numerous references to the change in VDOE reporting and then what we report in SIS. Because again, in looking at reading these charts, understanding them carefully, what is the difference?
So schools are putting into our student information system, or SIS, anything that they document as a referral. And right now, our schools are very inconsistent across schools. Some schools choose to document everything that happens when it comes to discipline. Others choose to only document the more serious things, and especially at the elementary level, oftentimes the only thing that gets documented is a suspension or something that's being sent to the hearings office. So for example, one school may choose to document when they call a parent and talk with the parent about a student's behavior, and other schools may not be choosing it.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. Right, because some, using parent view and all the rest of that, you have some teachers that will give feedback weekly on student behavior. So
That is not included as a behavior referral. This is a specific field or parts of the student information system where discipline referrals are captured. And so it's not about behavior, or if a child brings home a form that says they had a problem that day,
Right.
unless it's specifically chosen that the school is putting it into the student information system, it doesn't end up in the student information system. Suspensions, of course, have
Right.
to, and hearings office has to.
right.
The VDOE is a subset of those student information referrals that our Information Technology Department puts together and has to provide to the state. It's a requirement every year. The state requires that certain kinds of offenses, they tend to be the more serious offenses, must be reported. And they also require us to report, and have for many years, both in-school and out-of-school suspensions for students with disabilities. So regardless of what the specific violation was, they are required to report that. And then for general ed students, we've always had to report out-of-school suspensions. And then there was that change that I talked about following 2015-16, where we also now have to report, regardless of the violation, again, all in-school suspensions.
Okay, so then one more quick question. For reporting purposes, a child that is sent to a quieter place in the school because they need to be able to collect themselves. And I know we're going to have a lot of questions as to how that's termed. Where does that fall?
So right now, most schools, I would say, are not recording any of that, although schools that are starting to incorporate truly the MTSS system, those systems of supports, they are starting to see the need to document those kinds of things for themselves, and they're starting to develop their own internal systems for doing it. And that's part of the impetus behind what we're talking about, of making sure that not only is there consistency in what people put into the student information system, but that system, whatever we're doing, also reflects school needs to help document the kind of interventions they may be doing along the way. So, for example, if a student is, one of the tiered supports is they start out by having them just go to a quieter place in the school, either by their choice or the teacher's choice, that if that's something they're wanting to make sure they track, so that maybe the next time they need to escalate it and do something a little bit more strong, if it's the teacher's choice, then that's somehow documented someplace. And as I said, schools are starting to find ways of keeping track of that internally. Some of them have sort of a list of 10 or 20 things that they're supposed to do along the way, and they kind of keep track of it for students. But that's not currently ending up any place centrally in any of our student information system kinds of things. So some of what you mentioned of, a teacher may write something home to a parent, that may be coming off of that kind of a more internal school level look. So there's a need now to really match that MTSS requirement for tracking those kinds of supports with what we're currently having less consistency about, of putting things into the centralized system.
Right, because my concern is that there, even when we sometimes need a quiet spot to think for a moment, that's not an unusual thing. I would not want to get to a spot where we consider that a punishment or a negative. It helps to understand a child and what they need. But we have large, very active school settings, and for some kids, it gets to be too much for a while.
And I think I think you're pointing this out, one of the clear things that needs to happen is to understand what part of MTSS is just supportive of a child and
Right.
helping a child, and what part of it is really going to be considered a discipline referral, and having to make sure that the line between those is very clear. And that will be part of the challenge of making sure that we have the system available to support both aspects of that.
Right, because if you look at all of those,
Thank
as
you,
someone being a
Mrs. Roche.
discipline, you're never going to help the kid.
Okay, I have Not everybody has to speak, but I have everyone else on my go back list except for Mr. Wilson, and we only have 7 minutes left. So Ms. Pelching next. We're giving 1 minute each.
I'll be super brief. Number one, my question is, listening to all of this and moving forward, Dr. Duran, what is the possibility and feasibility of incorporating more of this work and this training into teacher training programs, especially with our partnership with GMU and our cohort models? And then just listening to Ms. Strauss, I think looking at the support side, because I've worked at a camp where just use headphones, right? So there are different ways, right, to help have teachers be prepared, right, to support students as much as possible within the classroom. And I don't know how much we're doing that across the board, but understanding the different needs.
Well, we definitely have a close partnership with GMU, and we certainly meet regularly. Our Office of Professional Learning, Family Engagement, as well as Instructional Services, do meet with them to talk about some of our instructional needs. We have not, though, I would say, talked more so around some of the needs. As we think about the MTSS framework, it's more around the instruction. How are we helping teachers prepare them around emotional, social learning, wellness, behavior? So I think that's definitely a good recommendation that we can take back to have with them. But we do have a good relationship and partnership, which is the good thing. It's just making sure we go deeper in having that kind of a conversation.
Okay, so but that would be kind of a next step. You're not, okay, thank you.
Dr. Kofax?
Quick question on resources and budget. When will we have, as we talked about, they talked about the A+ system, and because we're Fairfax, we're eventually going to want the A+ system. But in your 1 to 2 year strategies for success, when will we be able to have monies attached to what some of these preliminary plans look like?
We have most of those already, so I can, as a next step, I can provide that to you. The only one I do not is the one-time funding, the online, but I have all the others that I can send to you.
Yes, I would like to see that as a next step. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'm going to go back to Ms. Evans for 30 seconds.
All right, well, this also argues for us doing a major revisiting of our alternative schools, and to make sure that they are functioning in the way that we can best help our students. I do think we need to be cognizant of the fact that there are going to be times when students do need to be removed from regular schools. We do have to consider school safety. So with that, the one other comment is on trauma-informed. I've been gotten a comment from the PTA liaison on that, saying it shouldn't be a one and done, so that there needs to be ongoing. I do have several next steps, but I'll wait for the next steps to make more comments on that.
And we would absolutely agree. It's not a one and done. What we're proposing here in terms of following the framework of the scaffolding on that visual, the graphic. It's the awareness piece, the understanding, getting people to all take the cognito training, developing those school-based teams to build their capacity, and then supporting them for ongoing, consistent review and revisit of the trauma-informed. It is absolutely not a one and done, and we know that it's going to take much more than that. This is how we can begin to systematize it, though, in a way that will get us on that road towards that.
Okay, Ms. Karen Kiskamara, did you want to do another go back? I have next. Okay, thank you. I have Mrs. McLaughlin.
You have me too, right?
Ms. Corbett-Sanders, how could I forget Madam Chair?
No, just briefly, I would ask that this has been incredibly helpful, but as we're also seeing right now, it's incredibly rushed. And for some of us who've been trying to get this kind of movement for years and years, what I would ask Madam Chair, especially because there's a lot that we haven't been able to discuss with one another, and I think some of us, Dr. Duran, greatly appreciate the draft plan you've given us, but the board does govern the school system, so I would like a little more partnership on this in terms of the board being able to circle back on this however we determine in the next several months. That's reasonable, but no later than September to come back and have further conversation, especially with Superintendent Brabrand not being here. but I do appreciate the great work you guys are doing.
And that was the intent of the plan, was to present it to you for your discussion, and Mr. Moon and I talked offline that we probably wouldn't get to that, but so you at least had it to digest and to have, we would need to come back to determine what are the next steps in this plan. Similar to what we did with the equity resources plan, I provided some thoughts and you all added, enhanced, and amended that, so that's the intention of this as well.
And Ms. McLaughlin, I believe that Dr. Duran has committed to coming back to us in September, and I think at that point, we can do a revisit much of what we're talking about today, as well as the plan that he's bringing to us.
Thank you.
Ms. Corbett Sanders.
I will be really quick. 2 points. One is the subjectivity of certain behaviors and how they're accounted for, especially disruptive behaviors, and if we could have more granularity from you on how we can make them less subjective and more objective. And then the second piece is infusing, in an effort to have greater collaboration with parents, is infusing the notification and engagement of parents throughout a student's life, and not only just on discipline, but for proactive.
On the first question, I think we're going to talk a lot about that actually in the SR&R recommendation. So we can hold for that one around our recommendations around how to think about the subjectivity versus objectivity. We're going to go really deeper in there and
I've
talk
read
about
it.
that and hear your feedback on that. And so, but then also as we think about what the plan talks to in terms of under the policy section, the future revisions that need, as you'll see, I think it's 1B, and that's how we can need a continued revision, and then 1D, which is almost what, to use the word Dr. Osher said, a complete restructuring. So this is a beginning in the SR&R of where we can do that, but if we're really going to do that, it's not editing the SR&R, it's not providing very important amendments and tweaks to it, which are needed, but it's actually restructuring it in a way that thinks about the focus of positive discipline and multi-tier system of support, which we intend to do in our next revision for sure.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to have Mrs. Schultz as the very last 30 seconds.
30 seconds. One, we need a regular report of discipline to the board. 8 years I've been asking for that. And it needs to not be annual, it needs to be quarterly at least. Can we go to slide 28, please, of the overall presentation? I have a question that I didn't get to ask them. It wasn't important to ask them, but it's more important for us. It's talking about integrating the SEL. I'm concerned about the parental rights that appear. It came up on Thursday night with a parent speaker. It's not the first time I've heard that. Integrating SEL into other parts of the curriculum starts to get away from parental notice and parental opt-out. I want to be careful about that. A little bit, I feel like the plan that was presented by you, to be perfectly honest, was you've decided what the plan is and you're just informing us. I feel a little that we're not a part of the conversation. That was a very heavily prescribed plan that at one point you even said 4 through 7 are for the board's consideration. It's all for the board's consideration. And I feel a little bit like we've been cut out of this process, to be perfectly honest, that this much happened without you coming to us. A lot of us have been asking for this for quite some time, and we were not partners in this. We were afterthoughts. On the equity plan, on the question of youth survey, of asking additional questions in the youth survey, I think it's time that we look at a 360 review at the high school level, maybe at the middle school level, as opposed to just a question which a lot of kids don't participate in and which is often deemed they answer not necessarily truthfully. A 360 review, they would answer truthfully, and not for impairing a teacher's career, but for improving that environment. Who is the, I'm sorry, but this is the work. We've been waiting years for this.
We're going to set up a follow-up work session on this one so that we can continue having discussion, right? There are other board members all wanted to do
My
that.
last question that, for the record, is the equity stakeholder group, quote unquote, is meeting. Who is that? Who is that? Who's meeting? We don't know about it. I would love to know more about that.
Okay, with that, let's go to next steps. Dr. Duran, you want to respond?
Sure, I can respond. So in terms of the equity plan here, it was not prescriptive without the board. What was asked through the board's amendment is to provide, if you, on slide 1, if you go to slide 3, excuse me, of today's presentation, it was asked that I bring a draft of what the plan would be for the board to consider. And so that's what I was doing here in terms of the direction. And it was not, as I said at the beginning, unfortunately, you were here at the beginning when I talked about that I would be sharing that with the board to say that here are our best thinking at this time. We would not be taking action today. I wasn't asking for action at the onset of the work session today. That was kind of framing what that plan was about. So I had no intention of saying this was without the board. The intention was always what was asked of me to bring this back to the board for you to discuss and amend or change as need be. In terms of the equity stakeholder group, I'd be happy to share a list of who are those members. That again comes directly out of the equity plan from last year, when the board asked as the next step that we ensure that we have community stakeholder input in terms of the implementation of the plan and making sure that we weren't just moving forward and implementing the equity work without getting stakeholder input. So we have representatives from a variety of associations, all the teacher association, principal associations, SEPTA, PTA. There's a large list. I will make sure and get that to the board so you can see, but that was a direct result of a next step ask of me to make sure that as we implemented and rolled out the work, particularly around the cultural responsiveness training that was going to be happening, that we didn't just do that with staff, we had input. And so that is primarily what the group has been looking at, as we've been providing them updates on the work and getting their feedback so that we could adjust it as need be. And again, that was directly from a next step ask.
Okay, talking about next steps, could you put up the next steps? Do you think you can increase the font size a bit?
And I think that needs clarification of what we're talking about. It's a school-by-school report on the percent of students disciplined, referencing the 0 to 14%. They said it was anywhere between 0% and 14%. Of what? By school, that some schools had 0%, some had 14%. So I'm looking for a school by school. 0% discipline? That's according to the report.
Sorry, Ms. Evans, I just want to make sure we're clear when we're talking about students disciplined. I mean, we're talking about the VDOE reported discipline, because that's different. I want to make sure we've got the clear definition of what that 0 to 14%
Right.
statistic is.
So that's a good point. What is that 0 to 14?
So the 0 to 14 is the VDOE.
Mm-hmm.
So we can break that out by school.
All right. Do you
we
break it
can-
up by school for VDOE or no?
Typically, no.
Okay.
Yeah, typically the data is at the division level and it's provided actually incident by incident.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, does that capture your language?
It's provide details for mandatory professional development that should be taken by staff at each level. Or recommendations probably is a better term. Recommendations, if you look at the recommendations for professional development in the report, in the reports, it says, we should have more ABA, we should have more CA. I can give you all the different references, but there's multiple types of training and professional development listed throughout the documents. And so rather than and it's not prescriptive of mandatory versus, hey, voluntary. So I want more prescription as to what do you want, what's the minimum people should have as far as professional development?
Okay, so does that capture what you had on your mind?
Yes. Do you understand what it is, Dr. Duran?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you.
Ms. Corbett-Sanders, I just meant when it says taken by staff at each level of what?
I was thinking elementary, middle, and high. Is that what you were
Correct.
referring to?
Yes. Oh, no, I was just thinking
Okay,
those that
next one
touch.
is yours as well, Ms. Corbett Sanders, number 3.
Yes, throughout the report, you make recommendations on social emotional learning and that we should be more consistent in delivering this instruction in the curriculum, as well as in our teacher training. And so that's what I was looking for, incorporate more language on what you are asking for social emotional learning in our curriculum and in our teacher training.
Okay, number 4 is Keys Kamara.
So can I just say in our curriculum and teacher training instead of reports and training? And teacher training.
Okay, again, I'll be asking each proponent to make sure that the language up there captures what you are proposing. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. That does, I think I was talking about preventing referrals for students with disabilities, looking for preventative measures, and identifying those for the board. I believe that's what,
Could you read your,
perhaps interventions that how about identify intervention strategies specifically for students with disabilities to prevent discipline referrals?
Ms. Keys-Kamara, can we say intervention and de-escalation strategies?
Sure.
does that capture?
Yes.
Okay.
For now.
Okay, Mr. Schwartz, number 5.
Yeah, sure.
Number 6,
Can I have a real question? Is with Ms. Schultz, what do you mean by witness?
So we have staff interviewing
student witnesses.
other children to basically obtain information that will affect another child's trajectory. And I don't know that we should be interviewing children to obtain damning evidence on other children unless we involve parents in that parental notification.
So, Mr. Schwartz,
So
since...
should you add
just one-
student?
Just 1 second. Since we're discussing SR&R in the next session, you think there may be a better time to discuss that?
That's fine, because I have a lot of changes. Sorry.
Okay, so let's delete that for the time being. That's going to come back. Okay, and then we have Mr. Narcofax.
Good.
Mara on number 6.
I'm not sure that should be, those two should be combined. The first question has to do with looking at the alternative school model and how we can be more effective through that model. That's one.
Is that what you're asking from AIR?
I was asking, I did ask him that, but he said he was going to send more information, and I think as a board, we need to consider that as we go forward.
Would you mind including curriculum delivery on?
Sure.
Because that's specifically the problem with the alternative school
Sure.
model that we've run
Right,
into in
because he
closed
spoke
session.
about academics, and I am concerned about academics and having
So
some
Ms.
parity there.
So Ms. Keys-Gamarra, could you say more information on a healthy structure for an alternative school, a center or center model, and curriculum delivery? And that gets at what they consistently referred to is this, I know, that's why I'm asking for it, or their
okay.
planning center, alternative school.
That's fine with me as long as.
A planning center model and curriculum, because the planning center model is what he repeatedly talked about.
Yes, and as long as Dr. Duran understands what we're talking about, I'm good.
I understand what you'd like from them. We'll get that
Okay.
too, yes.
You should talk to me. Okay. Okay, and then the next one deals with how to, yes, let me read it. I'm sorry. Provide more information. Delivery. Okay. I think so, as long as Dr. Duran is okay.
Is it number 7?
And then number 7 is dealing specifically with how we're going to incorporate the hearings office in this cultural change or, right. So how can we incorporate the hearings office effectively in achieving cultural change in our discipline approach? Practices. And he's the boss, so this should work.
Okay, number 8 is Mrs. McLaughlin.
Yes, that one is correct. I didn't know if we'd want to be a little more specific in that, or if I'm just going to have another go, not a go. If it's not that, I want to add the next step, which is to involve AIR in this continued follow-up work. That was Dr. Mayo and Dr. Osher who spoke with us.
So, Ms. McLaughlin, can you bring the topic of disproportionality in discipline outcomes back as part of the equity discussion in September?
Yeah, I just want it back. I don't care
And
how
I think
it's
also
brought back.
capturing there would be important when Ms. Schultz raises around the discussion around the equity plan, because we need a discussion from the board around the recommendations, and it's the plan that we're all developing, so maybe we can include that there, because it's not just, to me, the outcomes, it's also what we want to see is what is our plan to address that.
Yep.
And so, is it down there? Well, maybe you can incorporate the two then, maybe? Okay.
Okay, yeah, that reads properly for me, Mr. Moon.
Mrs. McLaughlin, could you break that up into 2? Because involving AIR might require some financial resources.
Sure, absolutely, they can be, yep.
Provide information on involving AIR so that we can make an informed financial decision.
Yes.
If we want additional information from them, they can send that to us, but if we want them to come back and participate,
the work.
it will require additional financial for them to be here. But they will send us information, certainly.
Okay, number 10.
I would like this to be a little bit more specific. For number 10, I'd like to provide a quarterly report on discipline that is disaggregated by subgroup, region, and if possible, school, including when discipline incidents occur in the school year.
Okay, number 11.
Yeah, I'm imagining on the disaggregated, they're going to show us what types of, see, the problem is when they lump together, as we heard, what do we call it? Disruptive behavior with like weapons. That's a problem.
Could I recommend that we add that at minimum disaggregated? That way we could bring more information than what is just there.
You can always bring me more. That's what I want as a minimum.
Can I ask a quick question regarding the AIR coming back? Is there an intent for the gentleman from, or the people who did the Temple study to come and brief this board, or are we just using the annotated?
We can follow up with them, but that was not the part of the deliverable was to have the presentation available, and they were supposed to have been here last week. I can follow up with them and see if they're willing to come back at a later time. We have not had that conversation with them. Well, the final conversation was deliver the report and the presentation, so they annotated that report. But I can follow up with them.
Well, I think that individual board members should first read the report and then determine it, but it seems to me that that would be well worth hearing from them.
Yeah, Madam
Wait,
Chair,
they
I
were
think-
supposed to come last week and didn't?
Last week was our original work session that got moved due to graduations, and then they had a conflict. They were presenting another district, so they could not unfortunately be here. So what he did, Dr. Fergus, on his report, if you pull it up and you click on, he actually speaks to it, and you can hear him presenting it online, but it's not the same, obviously, him being here to answer a question.
If the deliverable was to be here to present it, then they should come back in the fall.
So,
when we do this again.
let's do this. Let's task Dr. Duran to contact Temple University and whether and when they could make themselves available.
Based on the board work session calendar. Okay, we'll do
Okay.
that.
So we were at number 11.
11. So the problem I have is, this is the type of group that I think, for example, the board members should have maybe appointed someone to. Like, I don't know how the decision was made to put people on this group, even if it was derivative of a previous next step. So I think we should look at that. And then I think that we should discuss who's on that and whether or not that's actually reflective of our original intent of the previous next step. So I didn't know that we went from the next step to full implementation without us knowing how it was going to happen and who would be involved. And I think that's important for us to know, because this is the group that's basically carrying this out.
And I fully agree. That's one of my recommendations. Number 4 was on the equity stakeholder meeting and how we better enhance that group. And I would agree with that the board would have an input into who would be coming to that in addition, who's already been here. So that's actually one of my recommendations, number 4. Up to this point, they've not been a decision-making or an action-making group or of any kind. They've really been for us to provide updates and get input on the work as directed by. But that is precisely, Michelle, that's why I put it on my recommendations as number 4, to bring that back to the board for more definition and clarity for next year. How do we use them, and how do you want to see them used to help us with this work?
So, Mr. Moon, I was actually going to ask for this as well. I would add on there the agendas of the meeting. I think it's important for us to know.
Happy to share those, the
what,
last.
Yeah, so meeting schedules, and yeah, that's fine there,
They,
too.
just for
Yeah.
clarity, they've met 3 times this past year. We're happy to show you the agendas for those and who was in attendance and who's been coming. But again, to reiterate, moving forward, my recommendation is how do we define that and use that group for all of this work? And that was why I put it before the board, so that you can help
Okay,
us
we are-
define that.
Now we are on number 12. Just want to remind board members that we are 35 minutes behind.
And
And
those
we'll be scheduling follow-up work session on this one, so we don't have to completely exhaust a list of all the possible next steps today.
So
Uh,
I codified what I had asked the outside expert for. That's just codifying that. On 13, this, I was going to mention this as a next step in my go-back, but didn't have the time. If the board agrees, I think we should be doing a regular survey of parents with students who are discipline involved, and get a report on that. So,
Like an exit survey or something, like an exit?
right.
Might want to make sure that we talk about what degree of discipline. I mean, if principals are just having a kid doing 1 day of in-school suspension.
I'm talking about
that's
the kids who go through the
Hearings office,
process.
600 kids a year.
Right, so perhaps that we should clarify that of parents with students who have been referred to the hearings office, is that the way to put it? Yeah. Okay. Okay, that's a good clarification.
Okay, number 14.
Yeah, that's just,
That's clear.
that's clear.
Okay, and then Mrs. McLaughlin, you had an additional next step.
Yeah, I had 2 next steps that, because we ran out of time, we couldn't get to. One is that the data we have, we did not present it based on our poverty rates. And so I'd like to see the statistics, at least the charts I was looking for, it was students with disabilities and race, but I'd like to see poverty.
You can just add.
The other
that's-
ones are
that's
in the main report. I can find which pages if you need me to help
Okay,
you track
so
it
you
down.
just, it was today's presentation
It was
that the charts were not
Yeah, it was
there.
just so, for the sake of brevity. although
Right,
it
well,
hasn't-
I appreciate that, but then I would draw to my colleagues' attention, it didn't end up then being part of what I think is a crucial part of our conversation. So for September, we'll want to do that because poverty is a big piece of it. And then the second thing is that I would like to, in our September follow-up conversation, Project Momentum model and how that could be used as a framework for the intentionality of the targeted supports to schools where we see high disproportionality in our discipline. And I'm saying that because that's been a really effective model in our school division, and I wanted to give props to Mark Greenfelder and his team that I think that model works extremely well for targeted work, and I'd like to hear from staff and Dr. Brabrand, why wouldn't we look at that as a potential vehicle for doing this type of work?
Okay, Keith Gamara.
Okay, I guess the best way to put it is develop a plan or present a plan to involve RASs, executive principals, or other current staff members to achieve a greater level of fidelity in our discipline process. Does that make sense?
Fidelity of implementation.
Yeah, okay.
And can I ask you to add "and inclusion in our school improvement plans"?
I couldn't hear you. Did you?
Can we add to it that "and inclusion in our school improvement plans"? Because that's part of the problem, is we don't have it as part of each of our SIPs that could address it.
Right. And then the next one would, if that's okay. Thank you.
Karen, can I just so we have clarification, when you say inclusion in our school improvement plans, you mean the discipline?
The inclusion in
Yes,
the
sir.
discipline.
The discipline.
Okay. Does that make sense?
Or
Ms.
inclusion of
okay.
addressing disproportionality and discipline in our school improvement plans.
Okay, as long as Dr. Duran is okay. I'd also like to consider the use of mindfulness programs. Is that something that we were, and the like? Is that something that was part of the consideration, Dr.?
That's part of thinking about the SEL curriculum and the RFP
Okay.
and what we would look for, but that warrants more discussion with the board in September around that plan. But yes, that is one of the considerations.
Okay. And this one, I think, kind of goes to what Tammy said, but I want to make sure, I was speaking specifically with respect to parents being involved when discipline is being considered. I know I've dealt with cases where particularly even very young kids have received fairly significant discipline, but the parents have not been a part of that discussion. And so to the extent that that's not clear, I want to make sure that it is clear.
So, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, do you mean proactive engagement of parents prior to discipline being imposed?
How about we say it this way? Consider parental involvement when developing a discipline plan for younger students. Does that make sense?
Just if I can speak to that, I think that is a little bit different than mine. Mine is,
Okay.
because I was talking specifically when we have those key sign warning factors, and we are not, so it's a little different. It's one is like, yours is like, they got in the system.
Right.
And mine was like, there's warning signs to try to keep them out. So yeah, so we can, I think they're two different looks.
That's fine, as long as
They are two
he's
different
under,
books, yeah.
right, okay.
Okay, hopefully there is nobody else. With a 20 is a good number.
I had a really quick, mine
Okay.
I had mentioned was just to start the conversation with our training partners about getting more of this into the teacher training,
The university
the
partners.
university partners. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah, my next one was up there. I mentioned about the youth survey and considering a 360 input from students, particularly at the high school level, rather than just adding questions to the youth survey.
That's up there, correct? 20?
There.
Okay, 21 is done. Okay, what, Mrs. McLaughlin?
Yeah, I think it was number 13 or 14 up there. That was mine, about the institute coming back for future work with us. I did want to share with you all that when I spoke to Dr. Mayo as they were leaving, he said that he felt in participating in this experience, he has a lot of ideas to continue enhancing our work. So I really do think and hope that we will take the advantage of continued collaboration with them.
Absolutely.
Just how much more we have to pay will be.
Oh, yeah, they're willing to send us any information from here, but to participate is a little different, and they're very open and willing to do that. But yes, it would cost
Would
for them
be-
to participate, but, so yes, both would be occurring.
I'm just expressing my public support for it.
Okay, anybody else? Otherwise, I'm not gonna go back one by one to ask for consensus. If there's any objection to adopting all those 21 or 22, seeing no objection, those will be adopted as next steps, and we'll take a 5-minute break.
Yeah, because we do need to get Dr. Braybrand on the phone for this next work session, so if we can make sure we have time for that.